One small step for man, one giant leap for rock and roll. The Beatles and the race to the moon were two of the greatest adventures of the 20th century. The DNA of the 60s, if you will. Two threads continuously intertwined from 1960 through about 1970. Into the Sky with Diamonds, a work of historical fiction, explores many behind-the-scenes stories of the 60s, hidden from the public until many years later. The book, written by Ron Grelsamer, who happens to be one of America's leading orthopedic surgeons when he's not writing books, is an exhilarating account of these two global phenomena, as seen through the eyes of the fictional character Dutch Rickman, who is a young, enterprising NASA engineer who manages to snag a front row seat to both. Hi, everyone. I'm Jim Alcon, editorial director of BookTrib, the leading source of book news and reviews. And I'm excited to be talking today with a fascinating personality and the author of Into the Sky with Diamonds, Ron Grelsamer. Ron, how are you doing today?
All right. Thank you for this opportunity.
Terrific. Here's Ron's book. You know, I was talking to an editor earlier today, and I said, if I thought of it, I would have come to this interview with long hair and my psychedelic sunglasses and beads and, you know, the tie-dye shirt, and really gotten into the mood. But I do that every day anyhow. So, you know, I don't want to do it again today. So let's get right into the book. It has been referred to, and then we talked about this a little, a historical fictional autobiography. So the average person, they hear historical fictional autobiography. Explain exactly what that means.
Sure. Well, this book is a history book. It's a history, as you said, of the Beatles and the race to the moon. But it is narrated in part by a fictional character who's telling his story. This is this fellow, Dutch Rickman, who works at NASA. He starts working there in the early 60s, and then he tells you everything that went on in his life. So it's an autobiography, but it's fictional because the character is fictional. Everything else, though, is essentially real.
So it's basically Dutch's autobiography, if you will. It's telling his story, but filtering in everything that happened in the 60s.
That's right.
Okay.
His autobiography is a way of is a vehicle to get all that information out on the space side.
Got it. So you know, when we were talking, you mentioned to me that you know, there are a couple of frequently asked questions that you always get asked about the book. So let's deal with the elephant in the room and get that out of the way right away. But I'm curious to the answer, and that is, why another book on the 60s? You know, why do we need this one, and what makes it so special?
Why another book on the 60s, and why a book on the Beatles? There are hundreds of books on the Beatles, and there are an equal number of books on the race to the moon. And the answer is, and I've read a great number of those books, and I love them. But in reading them, it dawned on me that most of these books are really for the super diehard fan. They're hundreds of pages long, and they are focused on just a few separate events. There's much more information than the average person would be interested in. And yet all of these books have a few really interesting stories that would interest anybody. They're just great human interest stories. And I thought, well, somebody should really take all these juicy stories and put them together. And then, since I like to write, I thought, well, why not yours truly? So that's what I did. I took the best, most interesting, sometimes previously unknown stories of the Beatles and the race to the moon, and I put them together in one book with two protagonists. One, the one you just mentioned, Dutch, who works at NASA, who's fictional, and the other protagonist, it was a very real person, Mal Evans, who was the Beatles' roadie. He was with them all the time. If you're watching the Get Back documentary now, you see him in every scene, and he was with them whenever they toured. So there's this conversation and letters written back and forth between these two characters. Dutch talks about space, Mal talks about the Beatles.
Well, it's interesting because I was watching a little bit of the Get Back movie, and I saw Mal Evans, and I thought, wait, Mal Evans, not that I knew the background of Mal Evans, except to know that he was a protagonist, you know, in the book. I wish your book was around when I was living in the 60s, because I mean, it took me about 10 years to get through the 60s. I could have done it through your book. Um,
Well, if
and
you
also,
remember,
go
sorry.
ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there.
That's a good way to put it. Um, so of all things in the 60s, you chose to focus on the Beatles and the race to the moon. Tell me how you decided to really distill it into those two main topics when there are so many other issues and phenomena and trends and icons of the 60s.
Well, I consider these two topics to be the two greatest adventures of the 60s. The Beatles are a musical adventure, and the race to the moon is a technological adventure. And you can't throw a dart at a calendar of the 60s without hitting a major Beatles or space event. The Beatles were always coming out with songs, albums, movies, and space. Well, you had a space shot all the time. I also have a lot of James Bond in the book because the book was originally going to be called Apollo, Beatles, Bond. And actually, the Bond stories are quite fascinating. I'm just looking at the 60s Bonds movies. And that's another great adventure, a movie,
Yeah.
can't pronounce cinematography, a movie adventure. So the Beatles, space, James Bond, those were the biggest deals of the 1960s. I'm not talking about politics and wars and riots. I'm talking about things with a positive attitude, positive spin.
Right, right. Well, you've got plenty of role models there, depending on your taste. But I mean, I'm sure James Bond. Well, actually, James Bond and his gadgets and the technology, sort of permeate, the art and the science of everything. But again, with the Beatles and NASA, I think you're,
Yeah. Well, something comes to mind. There's an intersection between James Bond and the Beatles because in the 1964 Goldfinger movie,
yeah,
James Bond is looking with disgust at some martini that hasn't been chilled or stirred.
right.
And he says, drinking this would be like listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
Huh. He says that.
Yeah, that's a line in the movie.
That's interesting. It was said by one reviewer that, and this is a quote: the book breathes new life and perspective to an entire decade, and it sheds new light and insight into a time that shook the world. So in terms of some of that new life and perspective and some of that insight, would you mind sharing, and we talked about it earlier, just a couple of anecdotes from the book that of fun things that were revealed? We'd love to hear that.
So on the space side, nearly every mission was a disaster. On nearly every mission, one or more astronauts nearly died. But that was not revealed to the public because NASA had a goal, which was to be positive. They needed funding from the government, and they didn't want bad news out there. And they had a pretty cozy relationship with the press. Things are very different today, but back then it worked. And so the public would have never known, for example, that Gus Grissom, the second man in space, well, he nearly died when his hatch blew open and his capsule sank, and he himself nearly drowned. Now, if you've read the right stuff or you've seen the movie, you kind of have an idea, but the public didn't know that at the time. And Neil Armstrong, the first man on the moon, he nearly died on his first space flight in his Gemini mission when his capsule started to spin out of control. So I go over these stories in greater detail, and it's quite fascinating to see how they survived and how the other astronauts survived their near-death experiences.
So you think,
White, yeah.
I'm sorry, I was going to say, so you think that the media was very protective of the whole NASA program, and when things like this happened, they worked in concert to try to keep this out of the news?
NASA promised them, access to stories, and in return, NASA, the press didn't give any bad news, if you wish. I mean, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, couldn't get back into his capsule. So that's a whole fascinating story there too that I go over in the book, Into the Sky with Diamonds. On the Beatles side, it wasn't necessarily secrets as crazy things that people never heard about. So for example, on their first, well, even their record contract, you would think that being that famous, now being that famous, in the 60s being that famous, that the Beatles would have had no trouble getting a record contract. Au contraire, mon frère. They had a lot of trouble. They couldn't get any contract in England. And the only reason they finally got something signed is because they were interviewed by George Martin, who was a producer of music, but also of comedy. And when the Beatles auditioned for him, he thought they were funny. Yeah, they had some musical talent, but that's not what impressed him so much. He was impressed by the fact that they were funny. And he worked with funny because that was his job. And he thought, okay, they're funny and they have some musical talent. That's the only reason they got signed. And then the American branch of their recording label had no interest in the Beatles. They had one #1 hit. They had a second #1 hit. They had a third #1 hit. They were all the rage throughout Europe. The American branch, Capitol Records, had no interest in the Beatles whatsoever. So how Alan Livingston, who was president of Capitol Records, finally was convinced to sign on the Beatles is a whole story in itself that I go into in the book. But it's rather remarkable.
Did Capitol Records just evaluated the songs and said that this group doesn't have a future?
Capitol Records, they were, first of all, they weren't that much into rock and roll, but they had the Beach Boys already. So they had one rock and roll act. Interestingly, the Beach Boys is BEA, just like the Beatles. But so they didn't feel they needed a second one. Secondly, they thought the name Beatles was disgusting. 3, they thought the Beatles' hair was outrageously long and disgusting also. And Alan Livingston didn't like the way they sang, the way they would jump one octave, I want to hold your hand. I mean, that just seemed ridiculous. So there was nothing about the Beatles that he liked.
Tell me about you were talking about when they did their first tour and the whole anecdote about Kansas City.
Yeah, so that's another wonderful story that most people don't know. Not that it's embarrassing, but there's so many other stories. So on their first tour, the Beatles were crisscrossing America in random fashion, it seemed, going from one coast to the other. It was pretty exhausting. They had one day off in the middle. Well, the owner of the then Kansas City Athletics, Charles O. Finley, wanted the Beatles to play on their day off. So they said, no, we have one day off. We'll catch you on our next tour. But he was very, very persistent, and he kept offering them more and more money than Frank Sinatra, more money than Barbra Streisand or any other big stars of the day.
And Ron, just to interject, for people who don't know Charles Finley, the owner of Kansas City, this guy was a real flamboyant showman. He was just not your typical baseball owner. He would introduce different color uniforms, and he had all sorts of gimmicks and gadgets. So this guy is thinking, I want the Beatles.
Right. He once put a midget on his team because the pitcher wouldn't be able to throw a strike. So anyway, so that's the kind of guy he was. So yeah, he just saw dollar signs all over the place. Anyway, so the Beatles finally agree to what today would be a mega $1 million contract to play one 30-minute gig. And then O'Finley says, by the way, considering the money I've just paid you, I would like you to play the song Kansas City, which was a 1950s standard. The Beatles were very familiar with that song. It was part of their repertoire. But they said, no, you bought our day off. You're not buying our song set. So the guy starts to offer them even more and more and more and more money. And they keep saying no. Well, I'm not going to reveal what happens next, but it's extremely interesting. And it's a real testament to the Beatles' personality as to what eventually happened. It was a wonderful resolution for everybody.
I want to say money can't buy me love, but I promise not to make any stupid Beatle jokes during this.
Yes, and it couldn't buy their song set.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you were writing this book, and obviously you have a passion for the 60s and everything that happened, were you thinking in terms of this is going to be a book that peers of ours and people who lived in the 60s are going to enjoy and be able to reminisce? Or were you thinking there are generations of people who have heard about the Beatles? Obviously, there's plenty to know about NASA and the Beatles and the whole times, but maybe not having lived it, you wanted to give them a new taste of that. What were you thinking in terms of your
Right,
audience?
that's exactly right. The target audience consisted of two groups: people who lived through the 60s, but would like to either reminisce or would like to hear some of these behind the scenes stories that they kind of know are out there, but they're all grouped in one book here. So for someone who's lived through the 60s, it's a very exciting read. And then there are those, as you say, who are familiar with the race to the moon. They know Neil Armstrong was the first American, and they know the Beatles because they know Yellow Submarine and Hey Jude. But they're curious to know what all the fuss is about. And so this book addresses that too. The stories are all so exciting that anybody in those two groups would be interested. It's the book that writes itself in a way. I didn't have to work hard to make the book exciting. The stories themselves are so exciting.
I also think that the technique you used by creating a fictional character and following this person, again, he was a NASA engineer, but as he starts to get into the music and everything else that's going on in the 60s, it has that thread and countered with a real life person, Mal, so I think that the technique of putting together, what I'll call a story, turning the 60s into a story through their eyes is a great way to go about it.
So to your point, we follow this fellow Dutch, but we also follow the major events of the 60s. So sometimes when you listen to a Beatles song like Revolution, it pays to know what was going on at the time because the song alludes to what was going on at the time. And so when you put the songs in the context of the politics, the sociology of the time, things make a lot more sense. NASA, for example, had a major failure when they first tested their Saturn rocket. The first time they sent it up, it blew up. That's like the worst possible news for NASA. But Martin Luther King was shot that day. So what do you think the newspapers focused on? Mm-hmm. So yeah, it was a horrible day, but it was a horrible day because Martin Luther King was shot, not because a Saturn rocket blew up. Anyway, so the book incorporates the events of the day to put them in context.
And I think, it's not just a question of, for people who, it's not a question of reminiscing. I think people who lived the 60s are going to hear new stories and new anecdotes and new angles to things that they either took for granted or accepted or knew.
So there's an analogy here with the Get Back documentary that's out right now as we speak. It's not just a question of reminiscing. You hear John and Paul talk, it'd be like listening to Mozart and Bach talk and discussing how to arrange a song and contradicting each other, making suggestions and making up songs right under your very eyes. And it's just fascinating. And in this book, you're not just reminiscing, you're learning about stuff that happened way back then, but people didn't know about it.
Let's talk about the Get Back documentary, the much anticipated one that released recently. And I know that, a lot of your book was timed a little bit to coincide with that as it came out.
Right.
What did you think of the documentary? Did you see the entire thing?
No, I'm halfway through the second episode. I saw the Let It Be movie. I saw it when it came out, and then I saw it again last year. In fact, I gave a little presentation to a group of friends. So I kind of know the story. I've seen the original movie. This is a remake of that movie, a much longer remake of that movie. But I am thoroughly enjoying it. I'm enjoying it much more than I thought. A little bit the way someone might say, I enjoy Into the Sky with Diamonds a lot more than I thought I might, because there's just so much that I didn't know and that I'm fascinated to learn about. Watching McCartney come up with the song Get Back as he's just strumming on his bass guitar, or watching two people discuss something and anything in the background, McCartney's working on the chords to Let It Be. He doesn't have the lyrics yet, but you can see he's working on the chords. That's fascinating. And they do a lot of that. You hear, it's impressive the number of songs that they came up with in that 3.5-week period of January 1969. Songs that wouldn't appear till years later on their own solo albums, but they already had them in their head in that session.
You know, I was watching a little bit of it with my wife, and you know, McCartney's calling out the chords, and Harrison
Right, he's playing,
playing it, and she said, she asked me, she said, did they have the music before this? Are they just hearing this for the first time?
Yeah.
Because if they are, it's incredible how the others, you know, how a professional musician, not only just not your average professional musician, but these guys, they could adapt, they could understand what Paul was trying to communicate with the chords and the whole melody and everything else. If he's just throwing this at them for the first time and they're adjusting and
Right.
figuring it
Well,
all
the
out.
same when McCartney's working on Get Back, he just has a bass. I've never heard of someone writing a song on a bass guitar, but he's strumming his bass guitar, and George Harrison is watching him, and he can hear and see what key he is in, and so he starts to improvise little leads and little things, just based off what he's hearing for the first time.
Mhm. Let's talk about you know, the book is available in paperback and as an ebook, but there's also an audiobook. And it's great that the audiobook, you know, recently won the coveted Earphones Awards from Audiophile magazine. I'd be interested to know, somebody who's written a book, how do you feel about the process of converting it, you know, to an audiobook? Or you tell me about, you know, figuring out who the narrator is going to be, how you get the voices down. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, it was, first of all, for anyone who's thinking of doing that, it was much harder than I ever expected. I just thought I would give the narrator my book and that would be it. But no, there are a lot of things you put in a book that doesn't translate to voice. So for example, if you have asterisks, you know, across the page to indicate that you're going to a different topic, the narrator can't say, okay, now there are 5 asterisks across the page. Or if you have a date at the top of a letter, it's very difficult. Things have to be reworded. Now, I was very lucky. I had a terrific producer, Mae Wethrich. She's the one who approached me in the first place to see if I'd be interested. And then she knows a number of excellent narrators, and I had to pick one out of the many that she gave me, Graham Halstead, and he did an amazing job. In fact, that's why the audiobook won an award. I just get reflected glory from that. He won the award for doing all the different voices. There are many, many characters in this book, including all the astronauts. And he researched the voices of all these astronauts. And then he and I together had to research Mal Evans, the other main character in the book, the Beatles roadie. First, he gave him a very exaggerated British accent. Mal Evans didn't have that kind of accent at all, but we were able to find an interview with him. And so through that interview, Graham was able to mimic his voice. He does a fabulous job, won an award.
Oh, that's great. What would you say was the most difficult aspect of writing the book?
Making sure it was accurate, because it is a history book. And so I had to do a lot of fact checking. And even with that, and by the way, on the book's website, and there is a website with the same name, Into the Sky with Diamonds, that has a lot of my memorabilia. So after each chapter, you can go to the website and look at the memorabilia corresponding to the chapter. But there is a chapter on the references that I used. But even then, after the first edition, I got many emails saying that this was a mistake and this was a mistake and this was a mistake. And so, of course, I made corrections. But sometimes 2 people will have different recollections of what happened. So who's to know? You know, I was reading McCartney's book that just came out, which, by the way, is phenomenal, The Lyrics. And I pick up some mistakes in there. It's like, wow, how am I the one picking up some mistakes in there? You would think he would know everything. So making it accurate is difficult, and getting everybody to agree that it's accurate is perhaps even more difficult.
What would you say was your favorite part about putting this whole thing together? What was the most fun?
Well, it was a labor of love. So the whole thing was fun from beginning to end. The most fun maybe was writing the last chapter because I had to decide at the very beginning how this would end.
Mhm.
And so I had a lot of fun thinking of different ideas. And I'm extraordinarily proud of the ending I came up with, which of course I can't release here. But I was very, very tickled. And that once I knew what the last page would be, that gave me the courage because it took me 15 years. Because as you pointed out, I have a real job that also requires a lot of writing. And I wrote a couple of books while I was writing this book. But this book was the most fun. You know, if I'm on a desert island and I can only take one thing I've ever done in my life with me, this would be it.
Very good. Are you a collector? If somebody came to your house, would there be a whole bunch of 60s memorabilia that they would see? Tell us about
Yes,
some of that stuff.
yes, there would be. I've been collecting Beatles and Jimi Hendrix and space memorabilia for 25 years or so. And that's one of the things that got me to write the book. And when you have a piece of memorabilia in your hand, like I have a part of Buzz Aldrin's notebook that went to the lunar surface with him. Well, you know, when you're holding something like that, you're holding a piece of American history right there in your hands. When you have a contract, a Beatles contract, or lyrics, or a book that they have signed, you're holding a piece of history, and that's really a lot of fun. And it makes for a lot of fun when people come over and want to look at it. They want to hold it in their hands.
Bet.
So some people,
oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say, some people are very prolific in their signing. So for example, Buzz Aldrin signs everything. And so a Buzz Aldrin signature isn't worth much unless it's on something that went to the moon with him. Then it's worth a lot.
Right.
But someone like Neil Armstrong hardly ever signed anything.
Mhm.
So any signature of his that's real, because there are fakes out there, but anything of his that's real is, you know, has some value to it, in addition to the fun of owning something that he signed.
So I asked you the question just when we were, talking about this interview in advance. I said, did you ever meet the Beatles, or what's the closest you ever came, to the Beatles? And you actually had a fascinating anecdote.
Well, it's an unusual one. You know, most people, if they meet somebody famous, it's at a restaurant or at some event where they think already maybe they're going to run into somebody famous. But no, for me, I was running on a beach from one very busy section to another very busy section of the beach. And in between those busy sections, it was deserted. So I'm jogging along the water, and in the distance, I see a man with his child at the very edge of the water. And just as I run behind that man and his son, a bigger wave comes and he pulls his son out of the water and literally bumps into me. Oh, excuse me. He's got a British accent. I look back, it was Paul McCartney. And I'd literally just run into Paul McCartney. And that was fun. I mean, not that we chatted, but I can literally say I have run into Paul McCartney.
That's great. For readers contemplating picking up this book, what would you say to them? What could you say to them that would make them go out and buy it tomorrow?
Well, the Beatles.
Besides everything we've talked about.
Yeah, well, I would say the Beatles and space are very much in the air, no pun intended, right now. You can't go anywhere without hearing about the Beatles right now. First, you had the Hulu documentary on Paul McCartney, which is probably still available, which is absolutely fascinating, where he goes through his songs and he discusses the bass and the harmonies. And then there's this Get Back documentary that just dropped last week, which is incredible. And then, of course, we have our own little space race between Musk and Bezos, trying to get us back to the moon and to Mars. They're all over the news. So these are very timely topics. And if you want to really be in the know on the Beatles or space, this is the book to read right now, tomorrow.
Well, Ron, we're just about out of time. Thanks so much for joining us. It was fascinating hearing about the 60s again, taking a little trip down memory lane. Again, everyone, the book is Into the Sky with Diamonds. It's available at all your popular bookstores and retail outlets where you would buy books. And we highly recommend it. So thanks again, Ron. Until next time, everybody, be well, and dare I say, go read a book.
All right, Jim. Thank you. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you. Be well.